Hey, this is Taska Black, and I'm gonna show you guys how I made my song Easier together with Emily Vaughn. Now, before we get started, I just wanna say thank you guys so much for listening. I've been getting a lot of sweet messages from all of you, so if you haven't listened to the song yet, go check it out on Spotify or wherever you listen to music, and let me know what you think. So let's get right to it. So this is what the project file looks like, and it looks very organized, but I'm usually not this organized, trust me. So for those of you who have not heard the song yet, I'll quickly play through it so you get a basic idea of what it sounds like. So let's start with the first and most important thing, which is the vocals. So what you're seeing here, all the yellow tracks are vocal tracks. And this is basically a condensed version of the bigger vocal project. So this song started out as a demo that I got from Emily a while ago. And a lot of that demo already sounded really good. So actually a lot of the parts from the demo are still in this project. But then when I was on tour in the US, I got into the studio with her and we actually redid a lot of takes, especially for the hook and the chorus. So this is basically a condensed version of like a 100-track vocal project. So let's start with the first track over here, which is the vocal lead. Which is basically the whole vocal melody condensed into one track. So there's already a bunch of effects that are printed in this stem, like compression. I used the CLA two-way and RVox by Waves on this one. And then there's some basic effects that I used in mixing on the vocal lead, but nothing really complicated. So as you can see, there's a lot of vocal layers going on here on top of that vocal lead. So let's quickly go through them and see how I processed them. So these are a couple delay and reverb layers or sends that I just mix in with the original lead vocal. So let's look at this one. This is just a reverb send. This is just Valhalla Vintage Reverb, completely wet, and I mix it in with the original. I also have a very narrow EQ here because I only want a couple frequencies to come through so it doesn't fight with that vocal lead. Now, there's two more reverb and delay throws right here. I use Echo Boy by Sound Toys, which is my go-to delay plugin. So let's move on to these layers over here. Basically, that's a bunch of layers that are layered with the vocal hook and the chorus. So let's see what that sounds like. That is basically a chorus and distortion layer. I used Guitar Rig for distortion, Little Alter Boy for form and shifting, so it's not quite the same as the vocal lead. It adds a little dimension to it, especially the chorus is going to make it a lot wider. Valhalla Room is going to make it, again, feel wider and more spacious to give sort of a thickness to that vocal hook. So the next thing up here is the reverb throw for the vocal hook. Over here we have the vocoder, and for this vocoder I use Manipulator by Infected Mushroom. This is pretty much my go-to vocoder when it comes to vocals. So yeah, really nice vocoder plugin. I also use Nectar by Isotope a lot, but yeah, for this purpose, I really like the sound of Manipulator. And again, it's kind of a narrow EQ because, again, I don't want all the high frequencies of all those layers to build up and fight with that original vocal lead. So up next, we have this layer over here, which is just an octave up of that original vocal lead. And that's an octave down. So pretty much this all beefs up the chorus and the vocal hook. Then down here, we have a vocal stack, which is pretty much different takes of that vocal hook just to make it wider and thicker. So together that sounds like this. Now I need to do what's best for me, but it doesn't make it easier to leave.
No, it doesn't make it easier to leave. What we want isn't the same as what we need, but it doesn't make it easier to leave.
All right, so up next we have the drums, which is actually very simple for this song. There's really not much exciting stuff going on here. Let me just solo that for you guys. So that's your basic 4 to the floor pattern. I'm not really gonna go into this because it's really not that special. So let's move on to the next thing, which is the mix bus. And this is basically all the instruments and all the synths and the basses that are not drums and not vocals. So let's start with the first thing over here, which is an acoustic guitar. And that acoustic guitar comes to play on the second verse, and that sounds like this.
Either way, it'll hurt to go.
So this is just an acoustic part that I played and recorded. And let me see what I did on these guitars. Really nothing special, just some compression, some reverb, a fab filter, multiband compression, some EQ. And then what I did here was I added the first couple seconds of every chord and I high passed it. So this is just the high frequencies of that first strum of those guitars. And together that sounds like this. And it's not particularly great. It doesn't sound particularly good with that extra layer, but in the whole mix, it brings forward that sparkle when you hit those strings and you do that strum with the guitar pick. And that's what I wanted in the song. So you hear that strum and then the notes just fade out.
Either way, it'll hurt to go just like it hurts to stay.
So let's move on to the next thing, which is the vocal chop. And that sounds like this. So this is basically just a chopped up version of that vocal lead melody. And let's look at the processing here. So I started off with Waves Tune just to make sure that all the notes were right in pitch. Some EQing, some reverb, going into a compressor. And this is something you can play around with. A lot of people tell you not to use reverb before a compressor, but sometimes I really like it because you compress that reverb as well and it gives a lot more space to a sound. If you want it to be spacious, sometimes you want a sound to have a lot of focus and you don't want that reverb feeding your compressor. But sometimes when you want that reverb to come forward, it's nice to have it going into your compressor. So just some EQ, some LFO tool for kind of that sidechain effect, the pumping effect. Then there's 3 multiband compressors here that are all basically trying to do a similar thing. So this is basically balancing out the sound. This is dealing with the high frequencies. So there's not, it's a de-esser, but really I'm using it just to tame the high frequencies. So there's no real harsh jumps in those highs. And then over here, again, just to balance out the sound. Then up here, I have a utility and I'm playing around with the stereo width of the sound. I'm actually making it more mono, so it sounds more focused and direct and in the middle of your mix, and that's exactly where I wanted that sound to be. Then some reverb, some echo, some more reverb. Again, this is me being very disorganized and very ineffective, but somehow I managed to get to something that I like with different reverbs and, weird chains. Again, this is 4 EQs, totally unnecessary, but it's basically me changing my mind every time, and I want to be able to A/B it. So whenever I have an EQ and I want to change something, I'll open a new EQ so I can A/B it really easily. And, later on, I will jump back into the song and I will hear frequencies that I, want to get rid of, and I'll just open up a new EQ for it as long as my CPU allows me to. So let's move to the next thing. This is just the same vocal chop, just an octave down, I believe. Then over here, we have 2 layers that sound really stupid by themselves. And this is basically to give a little bit of a width to that vocal chop. So I chose two different sounds that were kind of in the same range that would give a different feel to the left and the right side of the stereo field. So you have the vocal chop in the middle, you have a different sound on your left, and you have a different sound on your right. And that gives kind of a wider feel to it. So let's move on to the next part of the song, which is the piano, which is one of the most important parts of the song, I think. And I will show you guys how I make my signature piano. So it's actually a contact piano called Braunschweig. I think that's how you pronounce it, by Imperfect Samples. And it doesn't have any controls in the interface, but it sounds very realistic and imperfect. So this is what that sounds like. So what I did with this piano was I filtered out the really low frequencies, but because there was a little bit of a rumble going on there, and I layered it with the standard Ableton grand piano, and I took the low end and the low mid frequencies from that piano, and together they sound like this. So that's pretty much what the whole piano is built around in the song. There's a couple different piano layers that come to play in the chorus and the pre-chorus, which are just more kind of generic piano sounds. So that's pretty much it for the pianos. Then there's a lot of ambient sounds going on in the song, like this one. Which is basically just a sample that I resampled, and it's just a steady note throughout the whole song. And this is pretty much the same thing. So this is a flute that I sampled. It's just a little sample that I put into Simpler, and it sounds like this. And when you put that all together with those piano chords, it sounds really beautiful in my opinion. So I'm planning on doing a sample pack where I share all these sounds, like this lo-fi flute that I sampled. I'm planning on doing a sample pack where I share all these samples with you, so you can make the same sounds and resample them in your own way. So next up, let's move on to the strings. This is just a really tiny section in the song where I have a standard double bass. This is just standard Ableton string section in the packs over here. And they just play very particular notes that I wanted to add to the harmonic content with that piano. So up next, we have another chord layer over here. This is just a low-pass sine chord with a little bit of distortion on it. It's all printed to audio just to save some CPU on my computer, but it's a very simple sound just to give it some more low mids. Next up, we have this very distorted kind of sine chord that comes in the second chorus right before the second drop, and that sounds like this. So by itself, it sounds like this. And there's something very interesting going on here. So there's a ton of distortion on this synth, which I will show you in a minute. But when you play different notes together, it can either sound very, very ugly, or it can harmonically do something really cool where it all blends together into the distortion and, you know, makes a really cool sound. So I looked for notes that worked really well together, and that's what it ended up being. Then over here, I have that same synth, but I'm playing the higher notes of those chords. And then on that little chord jump over here, I added this little reverbed out bell sound, which is adding a little bit of a cool sound to that chord jump. And all together, that sounds like this. So let's see how I made this sound. This is actually a serum patch. It's a very simple sound. It's just kind of a sine wave with some distortion on it. Then over here, I have 2 isotope trash plugins that really do all the work. So they're just completely destroying that sound. So moving on, over here, we just have a pretty standard sub using Ableton's operator. Just a sine wave with a little bit of a layer on top of that, some saturation, some filtering, some more saturation using Decapitator by Soundtoys, some compression, some side chaining, some EQing, just pretty basic stuff. It's a pretty heavy sub. There's quite a lot of distortion and quite a lot of harmonic content there, but it kind of carries the drop by itself. So over here we have another bass layer, and I just filtered out those lower mid frequencies because I felt like the drop needed that. Basically the same thing. This is a massive patch, very simple patch. It's just a saw wave with some automation on the pitch over here, some distortion, some LFO tool for the pumping effect again, and then manipulator over here just to widen up the bass sound. And that's pretty much it. These are all simple melodies and little counter melodies that jump in here and there. So let's skip ahead through the guitars over here. So these are all electric guitars. And again, this is all printed to audio, but I record all of these guitars through an effect called bias effects, which is what I use most of the time to emulate guitar amps and to digitally just record my guitar straight into my audio interface. So let's start off with this first guitar layer over here. Which is a very quiet ambient kind of sound, just steady notes that play the whole song through. Then over here, there's another guitar pattern that comes in. And together with the piano chords, it sounds like this. And then in the next part, in the pre-chorus, it jumps 1 octave up. And then in the chorus, all the guitars drop out, all the ambient sounds drop out, and it's just this little guitar pattern that goes on top of the piano chords. So that's pretty much it, and that's really all there is to this song. So it's just a lot of ambient layers and little melodies supporting the chords and really supporting those piano chords, because that's the layer that's really carrying the song along with the vocal. So that's pretty much it. All right, I hope this gave you some insight in how I make my music. If you haven't checked out Easier yet, make sure to stream it on Spotify and let me know what you think in the comments down below. Also, let me know if you liked the video. Make sure to subscribe and like. It really helps me to see if you guys are into these kind of videos. And I hope to see you guys soon. Peace.